Welcome back, friends, to Tiny Town Trains TV. T4 here. It's time for this week's installment of My Favorite Railroads. This is where I talk about one of the railroads that will have a spot on the 9-level high layout build. You see, in addition to a featured railroad, one of the things that can make a layout more interesting is having your railroad interact with other railroads. This week, we're going to look at the Missouri Pacific. Now, the Missouri Pacific began in 1851 in St. Louis, Missouri, with the idea that they were going to build west along the Missouri River and just intersect all the towns that are along the way, including Kansas City and Omaha, which is what they did. Like many railways in that day and age, the Missouri Pacific had a rather sordid history. You see, although they began building in 1851, they didn't reach Kansas City until 1865. Now, this was largely because the Civil War interrupted the building of the railroad. Now, the Civil War ended in 1865, so it didn't take them very long once they got back to it to get to Kansas City. But despite this, they were the first railroad in Kansas City. Now, Kansas City wasn't much back then. St. Joe, Missouri, was actually the big town on the Missouri River. It wasn't really till later that Omaha and Kansas City surpassed St. Joe and became the bigger cities. Despite this apparent success, it wasn't but just a few short years later, in 1872, that the Pacific Railway was completely out of money. But new investors did come along, and they reorganized it as the Missouri Pacific Railway officially. And from that point on, the railway began to expand further, reaching places like Omaha and Pueblo, Colorado, and Wichita, Kansas. Now, the much larger Missouri Pacific system that you see here on the map, the Missouri Pacific of the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, was actually the result of acquisitions and mergers. The system was comprised of the old Pacific Railroad, plus the St. Louis, Iron Mountain, and Southern Railway, and the Texas and Pacific Railway, and the Chicago and Eastern Illinois Railroad, the St. Louis, Brownsville, and Mexico Railway, the Kansas, Oklahoma, and Gulf Railroad, and the Midland Valley Railroad, plus nearly a dozen other smaller railroads. At the same time the railroad was expanding, it continued to have its financial ups and downs. It had come under the control of Jay Gould, another big railroad financier. Now, Jay Gould was a very successful railroad financier, but when he died in the early 1890s and passed the railroad on to his son, just a few years later in 1915, the railroad was bankrupt again and he lost control of it. Later, the Missouri Pacific again declared bankruptcy for what amounts to a third time in 1933 as a result of the Great Depression, and was under bankruptcy trusteeship until 1956. Not only was the Missouri Pacific the first railroad west of the Mississippi River, not only was it the first railroad to Kansas City, but in the 1930s and 40s, their passenger train named the Sunshine Special was touted as the first air-conditioned train to operate in the Southwest. Now, otherwise, in the Streamline era, the Missouri Pacific's premier passenger trains were the Eagles. These were first inaugurated in the early 1940s. The most famous of which were the Missouri Eagle, the Delta Eagle, the Colorado Eagle, the Texas Eagle, and the Valley Eagle. Now, old T4, he's ridden on a few of these cars that were made for the Eagles back in the 1940s. And let me tell you, I have never ridden on a car that was smoother or quieter than these cars. Not before, not since. It's obvious they were great passenger trains. Now, the Missouri Pacific not only served St. Louis and Kansas City, but it connected the two cities together in what amounted to a double-track main line. It was double-tracked side by side from St. Louis to basically Jefferson City, the capital of Missouri. And there it split into two lines. One went straight west to Kansas City through Sedalia, and the other kept following the river up in a little more circuitous route through Lexington and other cities down to Kansas City that way. So on the 9-level high layout, not only will the Missouri Pacific appear in St. Louis and in the Parade of Railroads in Kansas City, but it's also going to have several junctions and interchanges along the way. If you enjoyed this video, or you just had nothing better to do, then like and subscribe, because Mrs. Tiny Town Trains really appreciates you keeping me out of her hair. Till next time, keep your train on the tracks, and I'll see you round the next bend. Take care now. T4 out.